Hi there, this is Mr. Cardoso, and this is our continuation on the introduction to objects. And in this video lesson, we're going to be talking a little bit about null pointer exceptions. We're working in our fraction class as we continue to use as our example throughout these lessons. And so this is our template class. This defines our object with the numerator and denominator. And then we've got constructors and instance methods as we've been building throughout these video lessons. If you haven't seen those, go back and watch those videos. And then we've got our fraction calculator class that we're using as the secondary programmer who will be using our fraction class. And remember, there can be many different secondary programmers using your fraction class and template to create fractions and make them interact in various different ways and so on and so forth. So, what is this null pointer exception? You may have seen this in the textbook. I haven't talked about it much yet, but you may have seen in the textbook where they check, if objects are equal to null and so on. So let's just talk a little bit about that. Now here we're in the interactions panel, and pretty much in the interactions panel we get to use our fraction class as an outsider. So we're like the secondary programmer. We can create some fraction objects, we can make them interact and so on as the secondary programmer using our template fraction class. So let's create some fractions. So I've already drawn some fractions over here, so let's go with that. So fraction f1 equals new fraction, and let's go 3, 5. So now we have this picture over here for f1, and fraction f2, in fact, let's not define it at all. Let's just go fraction f2 semicolon. And so we didn't use the new keyword, so what does that mean? F2 is actually pointing at null. So this symbol here, if you recall, this represents null. So now, let's take a look in our fraction class and let's try to call some methods. How about 2 decimal? We have a 2 decimal method in here somewhere. Some trouble finding it. One of the nice things about other IDEs is that they list all of your method headers on the side, so you can click to get to them easily. In alphabetical order, usually too. So here, 2 decimal. So let's actually get rid of this. I was doing this earlier just to test things out. So here, our 2 decimal method, it returns this dot num divided by this dot den. So the numerator divided by the denominator, and we're going to return in there. So let's just compile that. Oops, let's get rid of this. Just experimenting as well before the lesson. So with that compiled, let's go back to our interactions panel. Let's create those 2 fractions again. Alright, so now we've got our 2 decimal, which returns the numerator divided by the denominator as a double value, and it returns that. So if I go f1 dot 2 decimal, I should leave off the semicolon there, I'll get 0.6, which is 3/5. What if I do f2 dot 2 decimal? Well, f2 doesn't exist, right? It's pointing at null, so I get a null pointer exception. Now, null pointer exceptions, happen a little bit more frequently in the interactions panel than they would in an actual Java program like this fraction calculator. So let's shift over there and see the difference. The difference is, like the interactions panel, it's meant to test out things very quickly, compiles and runs each statement. So the rules are slightly different. It is still Java, but the rules are a little bit different of how it works. So let's try to do this same code over here. In fact, I've got it in my clipboard. So here's fraction f1, and we create fraction f2 pointing at null. And then let's try to multiply these 2 fractions, f1 dot times f2. So f1 is a real fraction pointing at 3/5. f2, however, is still pointing at null. So if we try to do that, it says f2 may not have been initialized. And so we get a compiler error, which is different than a null pointer exception. A null pointer exception, or an exception in general, is something that happens at runtime, which means the compiler didn't catch it. And if the compiler doesn't catch it, then the error goes all the way through to the user, and that's never a good thing. So in this case, the compiler caught it, so that's great. And so we're not getting our null pointer exception. But if you recall, in our interactions panel, we did. So for example, we could even try to do, let's change this to double, not the exact same example. Let's just results equals f2.2decimal. f2.2decimal. And we'll try to do that like we did here, f2.2decimal. And the reason why we have this here on the left is because, well, this is returning something, so we probably want to save it somewhere. But again, f2 doesn't exist, it's pointing at null, so when we go into 2 decimal, it doesn't know what this.num, f2.num, and f2.den are not defined yet. It's pointing at nothing. It's pointing at null. So again, here we get f2 may not have been initialized. It's an error, not a warning, so we cannot continue. It is a compiler error, and again, that's a good thing, because then we don't get that null pointer exception. So there are cases where you get the null pointer exception, especially in more sort of advanced situations, which we won't get to right now. But there are times where you do get the null pointer exception. In some places in the textbook, you'll see them go into some of these methods here, and so that we don't get this error, you can check, if this is not equal. If this is not equal to null, and we can compare any object to null. We can say this equals null, this not equal to null. We can say other. In this case, there's no other in this method, but here we could have said other equal null, or other not equal to null, or f1 if there was one defined, or for example here in answer, you could say is answer equal null or not equal to null. So any kind of object, whether it's a circle object, a fraction object, a rectangle object, a student object, whatever object that you create can be compared to null like this. And this is an instance of whatever this class is. In this case, this class is a fraction. So this is an instance of a fraction. And so fractions, just like any other object, can be compared to null. So you'll see in the textbook where they'll check to make sure that this is not equal to null or other is not equal to null before they continue. And it does, in fact, say in there that those comparisons are not necessary because the compiler will catch the error anyway. So sometimes, people double check to make sure that nothing goes wrong, and this is kind of one of those cases. For example, you don't want an elevator to collapse with 10 people in it, so you make sure it can support the weight of 20 people, but you still put the sign on the elevator that says maximum 10 people. That kind of thing. You want to double it up and make sure that you're checking all of those things. So that's what you'll see in the textbook, where they'll check, do these kinds of checks before they continue in some of the instance methods, but it's actually not necessary because the compiler does check to make sure that these are initialized before you try to call or place them into an instance. So because this one is taking all of these methods here, for example, plus equal or plus, they're taking a fraction object, and null is not considered to be a fraction object, so it wouldn't be allowed to be passed in here to other. So I hope that makes sense and explains a little bit. There were some questions about null pointer exceptions and when they happen and so on. But yeah, null pointer exception, if you ever see it, it's basically in this situation where your fraction or any of your object hasn't been initialized, and you're trying to access some of those fields without initializing it, then you can get a null pointer exception. But that's if you don't get the error here, the compiler error, where the variable hasn't been initialized first, because you might get that one first. I hope that makes sense in explaining null pointer exceptions, and we'll continue next time.